Welcome to this episode of Teach Me. I am joined again by Ayomikun, who you have heard on this podcast before, but this time it's on Teach Me. So, Ayomikun, if you could reintroduce yourself.
Yeah, so I am a fourth year at the University of Washington in Bothell, and I'm majoring in health studies, which is like a public health degree, and minoring in biology. And I've been doing research in biology since my freshman year. Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to be back.
Amazing, amazing. Happy to have you back. So you've done some research on how coral microbiomes relate to disease rates. So microbiomes are basically all of the microorganisms in a given environment. So could you teach me a bit about coral and how their microbiomes are related to disease rates?
Yeah, so corals, really cool. Like this really cool organism that you wouldn't like it's an animal, but most people wouldn't think of like you wouldn't think animal and think coral because
Yeah.
it looks like it's just staying still. But what you see in like a coral reef is a bunch of tiny little coral polyps that make up the organism. And so coral reefs, they're these hotbeds of biodiversity. And so, yeah, and they host a lot of really cool interactions. For example, one between the coral trout and the moray eel. The coral trout will go around the reef and snuff out prey, and then the prey will swim out, and then the moray eel will just start, munching down.
Doing this thing.
Um, and so that's like a mutualism outside of the coral, around the
Mhm.
coral, but one that's inside the coral is the one they have with their microbiome, which is, as you said, like the collection of microorganisms in their inside them. And
Yeah.
so there's actually three. So just for a little anatomy uh review on coral. So there's a mucus layer, which is like the mucus that you would think of in a human or whatever. There's a mucus layer and there's a tissue layer, which are the polyps, and there's a
Yeah.
skeleton. And so there's that little base. And so they actually have different microorganisms that live in these different regions. So in the mucus, for example, you'll find Halobacteria vorax. In the tissue, you'll find dinoflagellates. And in skeleton, you'll find ostriobium. That's not super important for what I'm going to talk about for the rest of it, but that's just like a little overview, right?
Okay.
And so corals actually have symbioses with these microorganisms. And so, for example, dinoflagellates, they will stay inside these little coral polyps. And so dinoflagellates they will photosynthesize and produce sugar, amino acids, lipids, which the coral can, take up. And then the coral will produce CO2, phosphorus, nitrogen, which the dinoflagellates can use. And so that's a cool little symbiosis that they have.
Yeah.
Um, and so some bacteria can actually defend coral, which is really cool. There's a few papers where you can just take some of the mucus. So if let's say you have two well plates
Mhm.
with a bunch of bacteria in there, or with, yeah. And then you put the mucus from a coral in one of those plates and leave the other. The one with the mucus will have way less bacteria. Like it's like this antibacterial thing. It's
Like
super
layer.
cool, wild.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's just so bacteria are clearly helping the coral in some way.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and so what are they defending against? They're defending against disease. And so a major threat to coral reefs is disease. And so I'll avoid getting into the details about this but this research, but the let's take an example at the Tektite Reef in the Virgin Islands. So there was a huge heat wave, and then there was a huge spike in disease, and then a bunch of loss in coral after that heat wave. So, like you can, so the heat wave caused the bleaching, which allowed disease to happen, and then we see a loss.
Yeah.
So that's pretty bad, right? We don't want these like organisms that are home to a lot of interactions
Yeah.
to die off, right? And so disease is actually worsened by global and local stressors like climate change, overfishing, nutrient pollution. But not all coral species suffer disease at the same rate. Um, there's actually a really wide variation on all that. Excuse me, sorry.
You're good.
Um, and so I as part of the Global Coral Micro Project, Global Coral Microbiome Project,
Yeah.
we seek to test if there are properties of coral microbiomes that correlate with that correlate with differences in disease susceptibility between species. Right? Does
Okay.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so sorry. So what we looked at was microbiome richness, which I'll explain real quick. It's so imagine it's like having a bunch of different, let's pretend the bacteria are animals. It's like having
Yeah.
a super wide variety of animals. We're testing how many different animals are there, or how
Yeah.
many different bacteria there are, versus disease. So that's what we did, a bunch of plotting. I won't get into the nitty gritty about the methods and all that,
Yeah.
but so a big part of yeah, sorry. Um, and so something we found was that skeletal eroding band was actually negatively correlated with microbiome richness. So as these corals microbiome got more diverse, they
Yeah.
got a decrease in skeletal eroding band, which is kind of a big deal because you don't really find this with a lot of other diseases. And so, yeah, it's really, I don't know, it's just a really cool finding. In skeletal eroding band, you see just as imagine uh just imagine a coral reef. You see a big old black band around it, and it's
Yeah.
just eroding. So, yeah, as the name suggests, it's yeah. Um, and so, and so all this is to say that we found diversity and disease are negatively correlated across species, which is a really big deal because that means that we can find ways to protect coral now that we know what's causing
What's
disease.
causing it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's that's my research on coral.
That's dope. That's dope. A quick question. What could be the effects of coral depletion over time? Like I know you talked about the like symbiotic relationships that like coral gives life to or gives access to. Um, but what are some of the effects that it could have if coral keeps on being depleted at the rate that it is? Because I know it's a big thing right now.
Oh, so that's a really good question. What would happen if coral are depleted? I think like that's real, like the species interactions that like happen around coral are super important to the health. Like corals are like at the base of like the the ecosystems that they're in. So once you take out that base, like you remove a lot of the things that are dependent on it. So for
Yeah.
example, algae grow on coral. They can overgrow on coral, but having algae that can have a place to, grow, pretty nice spot for something that eats algae. And
Yeah.
so just there's just like a lot, there's so many things that I could go into. But yeah, there's a lot of interactions that happen around coral and on coral that are basal to that are important to uh the health of the ecosystem. Sure.
It sounds like coral is very, very important.
Is there?
um, little less serious question. What do you think that the coolest part about coral is, or coolest like fact? Anything. What's your favorite part about coral?
Favorite part about coral? Dang, this is a good question. I what is my favorite part about coral? You know what? I'm gonna say something that's like a little basic, but the fact that they're just like this beautiful living organism that's like hundreds and hundreds of polyps just all collecting together to do the same thing. Like I don't like there's not a lot of or there's not really any organisms that are like that you think of as like a group.
Yeah.
Like when you think of a fish, you think of a singular fish, but corals, this beautiful amalgamation of low polyps. So,
Some
I
big
just think that's
words.
really cool. It's not
Yeah.
something that I would think of because, like, I remember when I was younger, I just thought coral were. I don't know what I thought they were.
I thought
Thought they were
I
like
thought they were plants.
Yeah, I thought they were similar to plants or something, but yeah. Yeah, that's my favorite part, probably.
That's dope though. That's dope. One of the things I want to be able to do one day is go scuba diving and then be able to see, or snorkeling, whichever one gives me access to being able to see coral up close and everything that goes on. But
Yeah.
super excited about that. We got to protect the coral.
Yeah. That's actually something that a lot of people on my team have been doing. I've been like scuba dive. So that you have to get the microbiome data, you have to actually scuba dive and collect samples of the coral
Yeah.
um, at the mucus, tissue, and skeleton level. And so, yeah,
Have you thought
that's
about
been.
doing that?
I thought about it. That'd be cool. I'm not sure if I'll be working on coral too much longer after.
True, true.
But yeah, yeah.
All right.
It'd be
Well,
cool to
thank you.
scuba dive though.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh,
Sorry.
well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Teach Me and sharing about your research. Really cool. Love coral. But yeah, it's always really cool to have you on this podcast and just talk to you about
Yeah.
all the different research you're doing, all the different things that you're doing. So
Yeah, it's sweet
thanks
to.
again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's sweet to be here. Yeah, love seeing the episodes. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.